There are mornings in Oxford when the air itself seems reluctant to wake. That one began with a half-hearted drizzle, the sort that hangs like doubt between pavement and sky. I remember the bells of St. Simeon's starting late as a hesitant chiming, more like a question than a call to prayer. I had been sitting by the window with a mug of cooling tea, and the Times folded to the crossword, which, as it happened, refused to yield to reason. The clue that stopped me was reading 6 letters before dawn. It seemed appropriate. Lewis called not long after. His voice, still polite but burdened with the early hour, mentioned something about a missing don, a locked vestry, and a light left burning. I told him I'd be there in an hour, though I knew I'd go sooner. Curiosity, I've found, is less a virtue than a compulsion. The drive to St. Simeon's took us through streets glazed with last night's rain. The wipers moved like a metronome marking some solemn rhythm, and Lewis spoke of the verger who'd found the vestry door ajar. He thought it might be nothing. I didn't. Colleges have a way of concealing their embarrassments behind polite explanations, and I'd learned long ago that an untidy story told too neatly always hides a lie. St. Simeon's sat behind a curtain of mist, its tower rising pale and penitential against the grey. The porter, a man of the old school with a tie that might once have been blue, greeted us with that mixture of suspicion and ceremony peculiar to Oxford porters. He led us to the chapel without speaking. Only the echo of our steps accompanied that hollow, self-conscious sound that churches reserve for intruders. Inside, the air smelt faintly of extinguished candles and damp hymn books. A lamp still glowed on the vestry table. Beside it, a cup of coffee had cooled into a dark puddle of neglect. There was an open hymnal, too, marked by a torn slip of paper. Lead, kindly light. I remember running a finger along the margin, feeling the faint, oily smudge where someone's thumb had pressed not long ago. Lewis busied himself with the practicalities. The lock, the light switch, the register. He asked if I thought there'd been foul play. I told him foulness often prefers to disguise itself as an accident. We found no sign of Dr. Julian Penhale. His gown still hung behind the vestry door. His bicycle remained chained near the gate. But absence, in my experience, is rarely innocent. It leaves a shape more haunting than presence. The chaplain arrived, flustered, apologetic, murmuring that Penhale had been unwell. Overwork, perhaps. A sabbatical had been mentioned. I watched him twist his ring as he spoke and wondered if guilt might have other disguises. When Lewis stepped outside to telephone headquarters, I lingered. The silence of the chapel was almost sentient, the kind that presses against one's thoughts until they echo back in altered form. I noticed then a small inscription carved into the stone near the lectern. Lux tacet ante matutinam. The light is silent before matins. I'd seen the phrase somewhere before, perhaps in a manuscript or an old sermon. It seemed both an admonition and a riddle. I walked slowly to the altar. On the floor beneath the front pew was a faint mark, a scuff where someone had dragged a chair or perhaps knelt too long. The candle wax nearby had melted unevenly, suggesting it had been lit long after evening prayers. I imagined Penhale here, alone, rehearsing some final conversation with himself. By the time Lewis returned, the bells had begun again clearer now, more certain of their purpose. He said the provost would meet us in his rooms at 11. I nodded, watching droplets gather on the stained-glass saints, each tiny sphere reflecting a warped world of color and distortion. I felt that the case, whatever it was, had already begun to speak in its own language, half Latin, half silence. On the way out, I noticed a bicycle pump leaning against the wall, damp and unused. Beside it, a scrap of newspaper clung to the flagstones of the crossword section, torn clean down the middle. The clue that remained visible read, before the dawn, 6 letters. That, too, felt appropriate. By the time we returned to St. Simeon's that afternoon, the rain had turned purposeful. It fell in sheets that blurred the edges of the quadrangle, erasing the statues into grey silhouettes. Lewis hunched into his coat beside me, muttering something about the weather being enough to wash the truth out of any place. I told him that truth, like mold, preferred damp conditions. He didn't laugh. The choir was rehearsing in the chapel, those fragile voices rising and breaking like bubbles through the stone. There's something indecent about such beauty being made in a place that has already known death, or the anticipation of it. Lydia Hart, the choir mistress, stood by the organ, her hair darkened by rain and her posture severe in the way of people who hold their dignity like armor. She greeted us with the weary courtesy of one accustomed to inquiries that promised inconvenience. She spoke of Dr. Penhale in the present tense, as though the act of conjugation could keep him alive. Brilliant, distracted, prone to losing his spectacles, too fond of melancholy composers. She mentioned a fondness for a particular psalm, the one about mercy and hidden sins. When I asked about his recent behavior, she hesitated, then said he'd been troubled by the restoration work in the crypt. Something about old coffins being moved. It unsettled him, she said, though she couldn't have told me why. Lewis was examining the lectern, his notebook already damp. He pointed out a small trail of candle wax hardened near the base. A trivial thing, but to my mind it whispered continuity evidence that someone had lingered here after Vespers. I bent down, noted the faint smear of soot on the hymn book shelf, and thought again of the phrase carved into the wall. Lux tacet ante matutinam. The light is silent before Matins. Perhaps Penhale had been searching for silence, or perhaps he'd feared it. When the choir began again, their voices reached us through the stone partition like the echo of something remembered rather than performed. The hymn was Lead, Kindly Light. Lydia's hands trembled faintly as she guided them. I watched her eyes drift once toward the vestry door, a glance too brief for guilt, too natural for indifference. There are glances like that which make an investigator's heart quicken, though reason demands patience. After the rehearsal, she walked us to the cloister. The rain had thickened into a mist that clung to the arches like breath on glass. She said Penhale had received a letter the day before he vanished, a letter with no return address. I asked if she had seen it. She hadn't, but she had noticed the envelope was thin, one sheet, no enclosure. A strange thing to recall, yet the detail remained, as small truths often do when larger ones collapse. Lewis went to check with the porter about that letter. I remained, watching the rain run in narrow threads down the stone. From somewhere behind us, the sound of a single bell drifted one, not the full peal. A mistake, perhaps, or a signal. I've learned that the line between the two is thin as breath. When Lewis returned, he had little to report. No one had seen Penhale since the previous evening, when he'd crossed the quadrangle toward the chapel carrying an umbrella and a book. A hymn book, perhaps, or his own translation of the Psalms. The porter said he'd seemed preoccupied but sober, the qualifier delivered with that peculiar relish Oxford men reserve for noting one another's temperance. We left the college under umbrellas, our shoes making slow work of the cobbles. I glanced back once at the chapel tower, where a faint light still burned through the rain high, small, defiant. It struck me that every act of disappearance begins not with movement, but with stillness. Later that night, back in my flat, I sat by the window again with the crossword. The same clue waited, obstinate. Before dawn, 6 letters. I tried Matins, of course, and found that it fitted. Yet something about it felt too easy, as if the answer, like the rain, concealed more than it revealed. There's a particular stillness that belongs only to Oxford mornings after rain. The air feels rinsed of certainty. Even the gargoyles look as though they have been weeping. Lewis and I arrived at St. Simeon's again, our coats steaming faintly in the weak sunlight that followed the storm. The quadrangle glistened like a pond left behind by memory. Somewhere, a bicycle bell rang and was absorbed into the hush that hangs so easily in places built for thought. The porter met us with the same mixture of reverence and fatigue. He had counted the hymnals, he said, as part of his routine. One was missing. Number 147. His tone suggested thefts of greater magnitude had gone unnoticed in that college, but he was troubled nonetheless. Lewis asked the obvious questions as I watched the man's fingers. They worried about the key ring in his pocket as if the metal might yield an explanation. Guilt, I have often observed, prefers to announce itself with small noises. We walked together into the chapel, now empty and cold. The scent of polish lingered, along with the faint tang of candle smoke. I traced my hand along the pews and stopped where the varnish dulled under a darker smear wax, perhaps, or something that had dried in secrecy. The light through the stained glass fell upon the organ pipes in stripes of muted color, like confession filtered through distance. Lewis found the hymnals stacked neatly beneath the lectern. He began to count. I listened to the echo of his numbers against the stone. 44, 45, 46. He paused. 47's gone, he said. 147. It struck me then, though I could not say why, that the number's symmetry mattered. Some crimes reveal themselves first through proportion. I picked up the nearest book and flipped through its pages. Each one bore the thumbprints of piety. Faint creases, smudged ink, a pressed flower now the color of ash. On the inside cover of one I found a borrowing slip, long unused. The names traced a history of the faithful heart, Penhale, Rowcroft. Lydia Hart's hand was neat, disciplined, the loops closed as if guarding themselves. Penhale's scrawl leaned forward like a man in a hurry. But it was the final name, Rowcroft, that held me. Written in a firmer, older hand and dated the day before, Penhale vanished. Lewis said something about coincidence. I pretended not to hear. In my experience, coincidences in Oxford are simply politenesses extended to the improbable. Outside, the rain had returned, thin and deliberate. I stood under the cloister arch and watched it form silver threads along the guttering. Across the courtyard, Lydia Hart emerged from the music room, carrying a sheaf of papers clutched to her chest. She saw us and hesitated not long enough for guilt, but long enough for recollection. I joined her under the arch. She said she'd been sorting through the choir's sheet music. I asked whether she'd borrowed a hymnal recently. She shook her head, eyes level, voice steady. Yet when I mentioned number 147, her gaze shifted to the chapel door and her breath misted unevenly in the air. After she left, Lewis said I was reading too much into a look. Perhaps. But I've learned that the face remembers what conscience tries to forget. We searched Penhale's rooms next to a scholar's burrow of half-read books, tobacco tins and unsent letters. The curtains were drawn despite the daylight, and on the desk lay a note to the provost, unfinished. The pen had bled into the blotter, leaving a small island of darkness. I read the single sentence that survived. The hour before Matins is not meant for the living. The word struck me as too deliberate for despair, too composed for panic. Lewis, ever practical, pointed out the absence of Penhale's umbrella. I reminded him that the missing hymnal might serve as better shelter. He smiled the way only the young can, with disbelief softened by duty. Before we left, I noticed the faint scent of lavender among the books, not the sort men use. I traced it to a small folded card pressed between two volumes of theology. On it was a verse from Psalm 51, written in a woman's hand, "Have mercy upon me, O God." That night, I could not sleep. I kept thinking of the symmetry of that missing number, the soft insistence of the rain, and the quiet certainty that mercy is rarely given to those who seek it too late. The Bodleian has its own weather, a kind of intellectual fog that lingers even on the clearest days. Dust, candle soot, the faint musk of parchment and polish, all of it suspended in the air like a secret no one dares to exhale. I remember walking through its archway that morning with Lewis trailing behind, his boots clapping too loudly against the worn stone. A porter greeted us with the reverence usually reserved for funerals, which, in a way, seemed appropriate. Penhale's desk had been sealed since his disappearance. It stood by a narrow window looking onto Radcliffe Square, a pool of grey light trembling over the chaos of his papers. Lewis observed, with that mixture of exasperation and pity he reserves for academics, that the man had lived in disarray. I corrected him gently. Disorder is not the absence of thought. Sometimes it's the overflow of it. Among the piles of notes, a thin envelope caught my eye. It had slid halfway beneath a dictionary of theology, as though trying to escape notice. The seal was broken, but intact enough to suggest secrecy disturbed only once. I lifted it carefully. Inside, a sheet of thick paper, half burned along one edge. The writing, elegant, deliberate, began mid-sentence and ended in ash. The surviving words read, "The hour before Matins, the sin of omission, forgiveness, withheld until dawn." Lewis asked if it was a suicide note. I told him I wasn't sure. Suicide notes announced themselves. This one seemed to whisper something less definite, not farewell, but confession. The burnt edge interested me more than the content. Fire leaves intent behind. Someone had tried to destroy the letter and thought better of it halfway through. That hesitation, I thought, might yet tell us everything. We brought the remains to the librarian's table, where Miss Treadgold, who had known Penhale for years, confirmed the handwriting. His, without question. She said he had spent recent evenings here, copying Latin from an illuminated psalter, muttering as he worked. She imitated his voice softly, not unkindly. It is not the text that damns, but the translation. The remark, like most made by theologians, could mean anything or nothing. As Lewis took statements, I lingered by the high windows. Rain had begun again, faint as dust. Beyond it, the spires looked half drowned in their own reflections. I thought of the missing hymnal, the vanished man, the symmetry of his habits. Scholars, for all their erudition, tend to repeat themselves even in disappearance. A small deduction arrived then, the kind that feels more like recollection than reasoning. The letter was addressed to the provost, but the envelope's watermark bore the crest of St. Hilda's College, not St. Simeon's. I knew that Celia Rowcroft lectured at St. Hilda's. An affair, perhaps, or at least an emotional correspondence mistaken for something more dangerous. Yet the tone of the letter, austere, penitential, was not that of a lover. It was the tone of a man begging absolution from someone with power to deny it. Lewis returned with a list of borrowed books and a frown. Only one volume missing from Penhale's record, he said, a treatise on the penitential psalms. Checked out 2 weeks before. No return. I asked the name of the last borrower before him. He read it aloud to Lydia Hart. I thanked him, though I already knew. Some patterns insist on being seen. Before leaving, I turned back once to look at Penhale's desk. The pen still rested in its stand, its nib blackened by old ink. The burn mark on the letter matched the stain where the lamp had stood too close to the page. A careless gesture, or a symbolic one. The theologian in him might have thought it fitting that truth, like faith, should require fire to be tested. Lewis asked what I made of the letter. I told him it was an apology written to the wrong person. He asked what that meant. I said I wasn't sure yet, though I knew perfectly well I was lying. That evening, back at my flat, I poured a whiskey and stared at the letter again beneath my lamp. The words "the hour before Matins" seemed to pulse faintly against the paper. I opened my crossword and found a clue I had skipped earlier. Burning guilt, 5 letters. I wrote Ashen and closed the paper. Some answers, I thought, arrive before the questions have learned to ask themselves. It was one of those afternoons when the clouds seemed unwilling to decide whether to break or hold. The river looked pewter, the air faintly metallic with the scent of rain deferred. Lewis and I stood outside a house that had known comfort once its ivy was too wild, its curtains too still. Mrs. Celia Rowcroft lived there, or rather, endured there. Widow to a scholar, blind for the last decade, her world is limited now to touch, scent, and memory, which I suspected are the most dangerous senses of all. She received us with a composure that might once have been charming. The drawing-room smelled faintly of camphor and hyacinth. On a low table stood a metronome, its pendulum motionless, as though even time required her permission to move. I introduced myself, and she smiled in the direction of my voice. "A policeman's tread is unmistakable," she said. I told her we'd come about Dr. Penhale. The pause that followed was a kind of music. Her husband sat by the window, his sightless eyes turned towards the light. When I asked if he'd known Penhale well, he replied that theology is a small world and that sin is smaller still. I thought it was an odd choice of words. His fingers worked restlessly over a closed Bible, as though counting a private rosary of resentment. Mrs. Rowcroft poured tea she did not drink. Her hands trembled only once, when she mentioned the lost manuscript. A translation, she said. One Penhale had been revising a modern rendering of the penitential psalms. He had lent her an early draft for comment, then accused her, half in jest, of keeping it too long. When I asked whether she had returned it, she said she believed she had, though her tone carried the delicate unease of someone who has begun to mistrust her own recollections. Lewis, standing behind her chair, noticed something I did not know. A hymnal resting on the piano, its spine cracked, the gilt title fading. He asked if it was hers. She hesitated, then said it belonged to the choir at St. Simeon's. Penhale had given it to her once, to copy a passage of verse. I moved closer. The ribbon marker rested at Psalm 51. Have mercy upon me, O God. The page was faintly warped, as though once exposed to damp. Candle wax, too, marked the margin. I remembered the same wax beside the pew in the chapel. Some clues repeat themselves until one learns to listen. I turned a few pages and found, pressed between them, a small slip of paper. Music notation, perhaps no, a fragment of correspondence. The ink had bled, but I could make out one phrase the hour before Matins. I felt the familiar quickening of intuition, that quiet, private pulse of recognition. I asked Mrs. Rowcroft if she'd ever heard Penhale use that phrase. She said she hadn't, though her husband's fingers stopped moving when I spoke it aloud. Outside, the rain had begun at last, a slow tapping on the conservatory roof. Lewis went to fetch the car while I lingered. Mrs. Rowcroft had turned toward the sound, her expression unreadable. I asked if she believed in absolution. Her answer came softly. Not for the living, Inspector. Not really. I left her standing beside the piano, her hand resting on the hymnal as though it were a relic. Through the window I saw the blind man reach out. Not for her, but toward the sound of our departing footsteps. It was a gesture too exact to be accidental for a man accustomed to locating others by the shape of their absence. In the car, Lewis remarked that the widow seemed fragile. I said that fragility was often a form of concealment. He asked what I meant. I told him that every confession is a duet. One sings, the other listens, but guilt provides the harmony. Back at the station, I set the hymnal on my desk. The faint scent of lavender still clung to it. I opened my notebook to jot down a thought and noticed an old crossword left unfinished. The clue at 17 down read, Mercy withheld 4 letters. I tried Sal, then Amen, and finally, none. It fitted. though not in the way the compiler intended. I've often thought that Oxford dinners are less about nourishment than ceremony. The ritual, the Latin grace, the careful folding of napkins, the weary Latin echoing through centuries conceals an unspoken understanding that civility is merely another form of concealment. The provost of St. Simeon's embodied that truth rather perfectly. His table was laid with quiet precision, his smile measured to the teaspoon. Lewis and I arrived late. The porter announced us with a decorum that bordered on irony. The hall smelled faintly of old wood smoke and overboiled salmon. Above us, portraits of forgotten benefactors stared down with that particular blend of sanctimony and suspicion the dead often reserve for the living. The provost greeted me with the warmth of a man rehearsing sincerity. "We're grateful for your attention, Inspector. A regrettable matter, of course, but not an unprecedented one. Oxford, after all, had lost scholars before some to scandal, others merely to themselves." He ushered me toward the high table where sherry already waited. Across the room, Lydia Hart was speaking to the chaplain, her laughter too careful, her posture too still. During the first course soup, thin and apologetic conversation drifted inevitably toward Dr. Penhale. The chaplain suggested overwork. The bursar muttered something about temperament. The provost, folding his napkin, remarked that genius often collapses under its own architecture. I said nothing. There are moments when silence extracts more truth than interrogation. Lewis, less bound by tact, asked whether Penhale had enemies. The provost's spoon paused mid-air. "None worth mentioning," he said finally. Then, as if regretting the precision of that phrase, he added that Penhale's academic ambitions had sometimes outpaced his diplomacy. The chaplain smiled a faint clerical smile designed to hide both knowledge and judgment. As the plates were cleared, a don at my right, Dr. Frobisher, of history, leaned toward me and murmured about the crypt restoration. "Strange business," he said. "The workmen heard noises down there last month. Thought it was rats, but one swore it was singing." I asked if Penhale had been involved. He had, apparently, inspected old tombs, translating epitaphs. Frobisher chuckled, though not kindly. Some men prefer the company of the dead. The wine was poor, but plentiful. Oxford generosity thrives on irony. By the time dessert arrived, the conversation had thinned into platitudes. I found myself studying the provost's hands, long, bony, immaculately clean. He poured claret without spilling a drop. A man of control, I thought, the sort who would rather polish a sin than confess it. When coffee came, I asked about Penhale's letter, the half-burned one addressed to the provost. He looked up sharply, then smiled. "Ah, yes, that. A melancholy note, really." Dr. Penhale was subjected to introspection. I pressed him gently. "Did he receive it?" He claimed not. Perhaps Penhale had intended to deliver it in person. I wondered whether guilt, like wine, improved when left to breathe. A small deduction arrived then, not dramatic, merely insistent. I noticed that the provost's cuff bore a faint brown mark, half hidden beneath the fabric. Wax, perhaps. Candle wax, the same shade as that found in the chapel. I asked if he'd attended the late service the night before Penhale disappeared. He said he hadn't, though the answer came a heartbeat too late. Lewis caught my eye, but said nothing. He was learning, slowly, that silence in Oxford speaks fluent deceit. After dinner, we followed the provost into his rooms for port. The air smelled of paper and pipe tobacco, the furniture arranged with an exactness bordering on the ecclesiastical. On the mantelpiece stood a photograph of Penhale, taken years earlier, younger, unburdened. The provost noticed my gaze and sighed. "Such a pity," he said. "A brilliant mind, perhaps too finely tuned for this world." I asked whether the missing hymnal had ever belonged to the college. He frowned as though trying to remember a dream. "Possibly," he said. "They change so often." Outside, the rain had returned, a faint percussion against the mullioned glass. The provost poured another round, his hands steady, his eyes distant. I left mine untouched. Lewis muttered something about the lateness of the hour. As we walked back across the quadrangle, I felt the damp creep through my shoes. The chapel tower loomed above us, the faint glimmer of its lamp barely visible through the mist. I thought of the wax on the provost's cuff, the half-burned letter, the hymn that spoke of mercy. Some connections arrive quietly, like a verse half-remembered in a language you once loved and lost. That night, as I wrote my notes, I could still hear the provost's voice, smooth as prayer, saying that Penhale had been too finely tuned. I wondered then, and still do, whether it was the world that had gone out of tune or merely the truth. There are voices that never quite leave you. The boy was one of them, thin, tremulous, pitched somewhere between fear and loyalty. Lewis had found him loitering near the cloister, pretending to rearrange hymn sheets while watching the rain pool between the flagstones. A face pale with the kind of innocence that Oxford often demands too early. He said his name was Andrew, though I suspected he'd have preferred not to have one at all that day. He spoke as children do when they've been told not to in fragments, with silences more revealing than words. He'd come early to morning practice, he said, and heard strange footsteps in the vestry long after the clock had struck 5. A man's voice, low and hurried, followed by the sound of something falling. He hadn't stayed. Fear, he told Lewis, doesn't wait for explanations. It only listens for doors. I asked him what he'd seen. A shape, he said, leaving by the side door near the crypt. He thought it was Dr. Penhale's coat looked the same, though he couldn't swear to it. What struck him most, however, was that the man carried a brown paper parcel roughly the size of a book. When pressed, he remembered another detail, a key dropped near the font, small and brass, which he'd later returned to the sacristy out of guilt. Children often seek forgiveness in the wrong places. Lewis found the key exactly where the boy described, tucked into a drawer of the music-room cabinet. It fitted a small locker at the back of the same room, half concealed behind a curtain of faded velvet. Inside, we found the parcel of Penhale's missing manuscript. Its pages were smudged with candle soot, the edges crimped as though someone had tried to dry them too quickly. On the flyleaf in Penhale's slanted hand, an inscription for L.H., whose voice once turned silence into faith. I didn't tell Lewis what I thought of that. Dedications are graves with the name still breathing. We took the manuscript back to the chapel, where I spread it across the vestry table. Marginal notes, traced in pencil, threaded between the lines, some written by Penhale, others, unmistakably, by Lydia Hart. I recognized her hand from the choir register, precise, inward, almost apologetic. 2 minds, 2 hearts, perhaps, arguing theology through translation. One note read simply, "Mercy misread is mercy denied." I could almost hear the quarrel that must have followed. Lewis asked whether we should speak to her again. I said we would, but not yet. Something about the boy's description lingered. The dropped key, the parcel, the voice at dawn. I asked him to fetch the porter's ledger from the gatehouse. When it arrived, I flipped to the morning of Penhale's disappearance. 2 entries stood out, both marked at 5 o'clock. One in the porter's usual hand, the other added later, faintly smudged, as if corrected. The Roman numeral had been altered I to 2. A small change, but small changes often conceal large fears. The rain had eased by then, leaving the quadrangle polished and hollow. I walked alone to the chapel, the boy's story replaying itself in my head like a psalm half forgotten. The vestry smelled of cold stone and wax. Beneath the lectern, a faint scuff where the floor had been scraped as if something heavy had been moved. The candle above it burned lower than the rest. a small thing, easily overlooked. But I've learned to trust the arrogance of details. They reveal themselves only to those willing to kneel before them. That evening I visited Lydia Hart's lodgings. She was alone, the room dim except for the glow of a single reading lamp. When I mentioned the manuscript, she flinched almost imperceptibly. She said she had helped Penhale with his translation, yes, but that their work had been purely scholarly. Her voice trembled slightly on the word purely. I asked if she'd seen him the night he vanished. She said no, then added that she'd been in the chapel, practicing the organ until midnight. It wasn't the denial that convinced me she was lying. It was the precision of her timeline. The guilty always measure time too carefully. When I left, I stood under the dripping eaves and listened to the rain returning. Somewhere across the quad, the choir was rehearsing. The boy's voice rose above the others, thin, clear, wavering on a note that refused to settle. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. Children rarely lie well, but sometimes they sing the truth without knowing it. I thought again of the dedication for L.H. Perhaps it wasn't a tribute after all, but an accusation. There are few sounds more disquieting than the echo of one's own footsteps underground. The chapel crypt of St. Simeon's had not been opened in decades or so, the provost had claimed, though his tone lacked conviction. The air beneath carried a smell of old dust and damp faithstone sweat and candle soot, mingling into something close to memory. Lewis walked ahead with the torch, his shadow wavering along the vaults like a second thought reluctant to follow him. It was here, amid the half-forgotten bones of benefactors and bishops, that Penhale had come in his final hours. Of that much I was certain. Not through deduction, but through atmosphere. The place had that peculiar stillness one encounters after truth has already passed by. The restoration work had been abandoned halfway, the scaffolding slick with condensation, the tools left in neat disarray as if interrupted by conscience. There were names carved into the slabs, their letters softened by time. Thomas Elvey, scholar. 1721. Anna Grace, wife and witness. The walls wept quietly, streaked with pale salts. Lewis muttered something about health and safety, which I ignored. My eyes had caught the faintest trace of wax on the floor near the first pillar, a single droplet, brownish recently. The wax was identical in hue to that found on the provost's cuff. A small symmetry, but symmetry is rarely accidental in Oxford. We followed the line of the candle stains to a recess behind the organ foundation, where the stone was darker, newly disturbed. The ground there bore the imprint of a stool, and beside it, half buried beneath silt, lay a brass object, a wallet clasp, tarnished but still firm. Inside, the initials J.P. gleamed faintly under Lewis's light. Penhale's wallet. I felt a curious sense of intrusion, as though opening it might summon him from wherever he'd chosen to hide. There was little inside an old photograph of the college choir, a folded note stained by moisture, and a bus ticket dated the previous day. The photograph showed him younger, eyes unsmiling, standing beside Lydia Hart at some college recital. Between them, faint but visible, stood Celia Rowcroft, her expression unreadable. The composition had been unintentional, but human arrangements rarely are. Lewis handed me the note. The writing was almost illegible, blurred by dampness. Yet one phrase survived. He knows. Meet before Matins. The words echoed uncomfortably against the inscription carved above the vestry wall. It wasn't the light that had been silent before Martin. It was the truth. We searched the rest of the crypt in silence. Near the far wall, beneath a half-covered slab, lay the remains of a candle holder, still sticky with wax. Beside it, the missing hymnal number, 147. Its cover was blackened, its edges warped by heat. I turned it over carefully. The ribbon marker rested predictably, at Psalm 51, "Have mercy upon me, O God." The words blurred as the flame from Lewis's torch flickered. I told him to switch it off. We stood for a while in the dark, the air heavy with the weight of things not yet said. From somewhere above came the muffled resonance of the organ pipes. Lydia must have begun her practice, unaware of the congregation we kept below. Each note seemed to press through the stone like breath through cloth. Lewis spoke quietly then. "Do you think he died here, sir?" I said, "Perhaps. But death," I added, "is not always an event. Sometimes it's a place one revisits until it becomes familiar." As we made to leave, my hand brushed against the pillar near the steps. A mark there, faint but deliberate, a cross etched in chalk, with the letter H beneath it. Not a mason's mark, too recent. I traced it with my thumb and felt, absurdly, that someone had left it as a kind of benediction or warning. Outside, the evening was bruised with clouds. The chapel lamps had already been lit, their light trembling on the puddles. Lewis locked the gate behind us. I asked him to send the wallet for analysis, though I knew it would tell us nothing the air hadn't already confessed. Later, in my flat, I opened the hymnal again. The pages, though stiff, released a faint scent of lavender. Between the leaves, I found a strand of dark hair finer than any man's. I closed the book. Some evidence, I thought, is less discovery than confirmation. The bells began their rehearsal above the mist, hesitant at first, then sure of themselves. I poured a measure of whiskey and listened. Their sound carried the same melancholy certainty that truth was coming and that it would arrive too late for anyone to be saved. There is a particular stillness that visits Oxford before dawn, when the city forgets itself, the cobbles dark with rain, the colleges breathing like old men in sleep. It was at such an hour that the truth began to stir, quietly, without ceremony. I'd returned to St. Simeon's, unable to leave the puzzle where it lay. The air was raw, the lamps along the cloister paling into the suggestion of light. The porter's lodge was empty. A ledger sat open on the counter, its pages damp from a carelessly shut window. I turned to the night of Penhale's disappearance. The neat, slanted handwriting recorded his departure at 5 o'clock. But below it, faint and recently altered, a second line repeated the same time. The I of the Roman numeral had been thickened to a tfegui, as though the truth itself were trying to correct an oversight. Someone had added the second entry later. Someone anxious that a single exit might not suffice. Lewis arrived with his usual punctual despair and found me already at the desk. He frowned at the page, then at me. "You think it's important?" he asked. I said everything is, provided one looks at it long enough. The porter, roused from whatever corner he'd found for sleep, blinked in confusion. "Only one, sir. That's what I wrote." I pointed to the thickened numeral. He shrugged. "Perhaps an ink blot," he suggested. But the ink was newer, fresher. Ink does not lie. It merely fades. We walked together toward the chapel. The stones glistened with dew, and the sound of our shoes echoed like an afterthought. Inside, the air was still bruised with wax and cold incense. Lydia Hart was there, seated at the organ, her fingers motionless on the keys. The first light fell across her face, pale and hollowed by sleeplessness. She said she'd come early and needed to play. Music, I've often thought, is a more acceptable form of confession. I told her we had found Penhale's hymnal and his wallet. She said nothing at first, only closed her eyes as if listening for a note she'd forgotten. When she spoke, it was almost to herself. He asked me to meet him here that night, before Matins. He said he couldn't carry the secret any longer, but when I came he was already gone. She turned to the organ, struck a single chord, and let it die. Lewis asked the question that hovered in both our minds. "Gone how?" She shook her head. I found him lying near the crypt door. I thought he was sleeping. I knelt beside him and his skin was cold. He looked peaceful, almost relieved. I couldn't call anyone. Not yet. I was afraid of what they'd say. Afraid of what they'd think. She hesitated. I burned the letter he'd written. The one to the provost. It was foolish, I know, but I wanted to protect him. I asked what she'd meant by secret. She met my gaze then, and something like defiance flickered there. It wasn't mine to tell. He had made a mistake long ago, one that had followed him here. I pressed her gently. She looked away, toward the stained glass where the light had begun to gather. He said the dead forgive more easily than the living. Lewis, uncomfortable with the intimacy of it, busied himself with the vestry door. I stepped closer to the ledger still open on the lectern, the register of services. The same handwriting marked the attendance for that morning, but someone had corrected it with a faint smudge where a name had been erased. Beneath the thin layer of graphite dust, the first letter remained visible. R. The Rowcrofts had been present that morning after all. The widow, perhaps, or the blind husband she guided. The alteration struck me as both deliberate and desperate. When we left, Lydia remained at the organ, her hands resting on the silent keys. Outside, the bells began their rehearsal, low and uncertain. I watched the windows tremble with the sound and thought of Penhale's final hours. The candle burning, the hymn of mercy murmured into stone. In the porter's lodge, I looked once more at the ledger. 2 entries, 1 time. One man leaving, another pretending to follow. The symmetry was perfect, the deceit almost elegant. As Lewis locked the door behind us, I caught sight of the crossword folded in my pocket. The clue I'd struggled with for days returned unbidden duplicity 7 letters. I wrote the answer mentally, and it fitted too well to be comforting. Silence. It is strange, the way dawn can make guilt look almost beautiful. The mist had risen from the river like an unspoken breath, curling around the chapel spire of St. Simeon's in a kind of reluctant forgiveness. I remember standing in the quadrangle, coat collar turned up, listening to the first faint toll of the bells. The sound was neither mourning nor celebration, merely the acknowledgement of what could no longer be undone. Penhale's body had been found at last, though not by us. A workman repairing the chapel floor had uncovered the narrow cavity beneath the crypt stairs. He'd assumed at first it was a broken coffin, but coffins, I've learned, seldom wear spectacles. Death, in its quiet way, had folded Penhale neatly into the earth. The doctor called it heart failure. The provost called it a tragedy. I called it something else entirely. Lewis stood beside me in the rain, coat damp, face unreadable. We'd spent the morning in statements and signatures, the bureaucratic afterlife of discovery. He said little, but I could feel the disquiet gathering in him, that uneasy sense that a man's last act should mean something. I told him meaning is rarely the point. Timing is. Inside the chapel, the choir was rehearsing. Lydia Hart's voice floated above the others, pure, fragile, exhausted. The hymn, as fate would have it, was Lead, kindly light. I watched her through the half-open door, her hands trembling slightly on the organ keys. Grief and guilt are close relatives. Sometimes they wear each other's clothes. When the hymn ended, she joined us by the vestry. Her face was pale, her eyes rimmed red. She said she had come to pray. I asked whether she'd prayed before, the night he died. She looked at me, then properly looked, and something in her expression told me that honesty had finally grown too heavy to carry. He had asked her to meet him at the chapel before dawn. He'd spoken of confession, not to the church, but to her. She came late, frightened, and found him already collapsed near the crypt entrance. The lamp beside him had gutted out, only the candle on the hymnal still burned. She had tried to rouse him, failed, then fled to fetch help, but returned instead with a match and the impulse to hide what love had left undone. The half-burned letter, The rearranged ledger, the silence of the choir boy, all of it had been her shield against scandal. Lewis asked, gently, why she hadn't told us sooner. She said Oxford has no mercy for its women, not even when they sin out of love. I let her go. There was nothing left to be gained from her confession, and perhaps less to be preserved by it. She would carry her penance quietly, as all intelligent people do. The provost summoned me to his rooms later that afternoon. He thanked me in an official manner, offered whiskey, and declined to meet my eyes. I noticed a fresh candle on his desk, the same make and color as those from the chapel. When I asked whether he'd known about Penhale's illness, he said only that the man had been unwell in spirit. I told him I understood. I think he believed me. By evening, the case had been filed, and the world had moved on to its next moral puzzle. Lewis left for home. I walked instead to the chapel, drawn by habit rather than duty. The choir had gone. The air was dense with the ghost of their voices. I stood before the lectern, tracing the wax marks on the floor, the darkened corner where the hymnal had lain. On the wall above, the inscription caught the last of the light lux tacet ante matutinam. The light is silent before matins. It was not confession, I realized, that Penhale sought, but silence, the only absolution left to those who can no longer bear the sound of themselves. I took my seat in the last pew. The bells began their slow ascent to the hour, each strike dissolving into rain. Somewhere in the distance, a blackbird answered. I thought of the crossword folded in my coat pocket. The final clue before dawn is 6 letters. I filled it in with the only word that ever seemed to fit. Matins. It rained again that morning, the kind of rain Oxford wears like a borrowed melancholy, thin and unconvincing. The courtyard of St. Simeon's lay quiet, the puddles trembling with every hesitant bell stroke from the chapel tower. They had rung before, those bells, at the beginning of the affair, uncertain then, uncertain now. Only the echoes seemed older. Penhale was gone, the investigation closed, the college eager to return to its familiar ritual of forgetting. A small memorial had been arranged in the chapel, tasteful, brief, and faintly embarrassed. The provost had read a few words about scholarship and service. Lydia Hart had played a slow, hesitant hymn that broke once in the middle before recovering, like someone caught weeping but determined to finish. Even the candles had burned with a kind of restraint, their smoke curling upward as if reluctant to mingle with the air. Lewis stood beside me in the back pew, his expression the polite neutrality of a man who knows his superior dislikes ceremony. When the choir began, lead kindly light, he shifted awkwardly, perhaps remembering the hymn's earlier presence in the case, the vestry, the hymnal, the dying lamp. I wondered if he felt the same quiet disquiet that had settled into me, that sense that completion in such matters is merely a bureaucratic illusion. Afterwards, the provost approached. He thanked us both for our discretion, a word that carries its own accusation. I noticed his sleeve clean now, scrubbed of the candle wax I had once seen there. He asked whether the coroner's verdict satisfied me. I told him satisfaction was not part of my profession. His smile flickered, then died, like a candle encountering a drought. The choir boys filed past, heads bowed, shoes tapping softly against the stone. Andrew, the youngest, met my gaze for an instant. The child's eyes carried something like recognition or relief, perhaps both. I thought again of his trembling confession, of the key, the parcel, the voice in the vestry. Children often bear witness without understanding what they have seen. It is their tragedy and, sometimes, their salvation. Lewis and I walked once more through the quadrangle. The rain had gentled to mist, softening the outlines of the cloisters. He spoke about lunch, about a pub near Jericho that did a tolerable shepherd's pie. I said perhaps another day. He hesitated, sensing my disinclination for company, and said nothing more. When he'd gone, I lingered near the gate. From there I could see the chapel lamp still burning faintly in the gloom, one small, stubborn light against the indifference of stone. Later that evening, back in my flat, I poured a measure of whiskey and opened the crossword. The day's clue at 14 across read, "Forgiveness, 5 letters." I thought for a while before writing grace. It fitted, though I doubted its accuracy. Forgiveness, in my experience, rarely finds the right space. The case file lay open on my desk, the photograph of Penhale staring back at me with that unreadable blend of sorrow and pride peculiar to the recently absolved. His manuscript, now restored, would be published posthumously as the provost's gesture of institutional mercy. Lydia Hart had resigned her position for the official reason, exhaustion. She would, I imagined, find a quieter life somewhere beyond Oxford, somewhere unchronicled. I closed the file, but a small thought persisted, that faint irregularity in the porter's ledger, the second entry. It had been amended, yes, but the handwriting was neither the porter's nor Lydia's. It was the provost's. I had confirmed it quietly, almost idly, on another page of the college accounts. Whether he had altered it to conceal guilt or compassion, I never learned. Perhaps both. The line between mercy and deceit is thin as the scratch of a pen. The bells began again, distant but clear. Their tone had changed softer, slower, like a mind finally resigned to its own echo. I leaned back, listening, and let the sound drift through the open window. Oxford has a way of folding even its scandals into harmony. The rain tapped lightly against the glass, patient, repetitive, forgiving nothing but washing everything just enough to make forgetting possible. Somewhere in the distance, I imagined, the choir practicing again, the faint rise of the boy's voice threading through the air. I thought of Penhale's final words, the letter's half-burned confession, the hymn book's faint scent of lavender. It was not a revelation I felt then, but something quieter, an understanding that truth, like music, survives not in its notes, but in its silences. When the bells fell still, I realized how accustomed I had become to their sound. They seemed, at that moment, less an ending than a continuation, the final verse of a hymn left open for another day. I finished my drink, folded the crossword, and sat listening to the quiet. The hour before Matins was long past, but the light, as ever, refused to go out.